Welcome to the Atheists of Florida YouTube channel. We are pleased to offer some of the most significant speakers and profound issues of our times. If you like today's video, please hit the like button. If you have already subscribed, thank you. If not, you know what to do.
Well, thank you everybody for having me, and thank you, Judy, for the very kind invitation. I'm going to be talking today a little bit about Christian nationalism and what's going on in the States, something that American Atheists is acutely focused on, and that I hope everyone here is paying attention to, certainly. I'm going to share my screen, so if you give me just 1 second, I will get that going. Just 1 moment. See if I can do this correctly. Fingers crossed. All right, did that work?
Yes.
Great. All right, so let me actually go back to the beginning here. There we go. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in the States. The States are certainly a fertile ground for the ongoing attacks on our values as atheists, on American democracy, and on a whole host of issues that members of our community care very deeply about. Which is why this is an area where American Atheists is putting most of its resources and really dedicating a lot of organizing effort, a lot of time, and certainly a lot of operational resources as well. So just to kind of run through the agenda on things here, I'm going to start out with just a quick summary of what this thing is, what we're talking about here, talk a little bit about where we stand as far as state policy, what we've seen over the last couple of years, what we anticipate happening on the horizon. I'll talk a little bit about some of the tools that we have in our toolbox to fight back and what that might look like for all of you. And then I'll be happy to take as many questions as folks would like. I'm not planning on, and I really don't have a horse in the race for what's starting at 6:30, but some people might. And so I'll make sure to be as brisk and get through things without a lot of delay, if it just so happens that there's somebody who does want to take a watch at that. So we'll do our best. So let me just start with a quick introduction on things. What exactly is Christian nationalism? What are we talking about when we talk about Christian nationalism? I'm sure most of you have heard of this term, and I'm sure many of you have more of an understanding of it than the vast majority of Americans do. So just to reiterate, Christian nationalism is the incorrect belief that the United States is defined by Christianity, that it was founded as a Christian nation, and most importantly in the conversation today, that the government should take active steps to keep it that way, or in fact return it to that original character. Popularly, a lot of Christian nationalists will assert that that we're a Christian nation, not just as an observation about American history, but as like a prescriptive program for the types of policies that we should be making, what religion should be permitted in the public square, whether or not there is even a wall of separation between religion and government, and what that might look like. For a good introduction to this, I might suggest reading Andrew Seidel's really outstanding book called The Founding Myth. It's a great introduction about Christian nationalism. In fact, right here, you should read Andrew's book. It's great. Available at all fine book retailers, and I'm sure if you buy it from FFRF, Andrew will be happy to sign it for you. So, little plug there. He has a really great quote that he's used a lot and that I will give credit for, but then will steal, which is essentially something along the lines of, America can be a Christian nation or it can be America, because the moment that we create a Christian nation, it stops being America. It's so antithetical. Christian nationalism is so antithetical to our values that it undercuts everything that we hold dear as a country and that we as a community value, and that, by the way, the overwhelming majority of Americans hold valuable as well. Christian nationalism, once you spell it out, is not a popular position in political discourse. It needs to be relegated to the fringe of the fringe, and yet it has a seat at the table with far too many political power brokers and is too well funded for us to just ignore this problem and pretend it's going to go away. Just as an additional shout out, I really want to commend the work that FFRF and Andrew in particular did in bringing together some of the partners that we've worked with over the course of these last few years at the state level in putting out a report that illustrated exactly what happened on January 6th of last year and the ties of that to Christian nationalism. They just released it earlier this week. They did that in collaboration with the Baptist Joint Committee, which is a pro-religious freedom, religious equality group that we see eye to eye on a whole host of issues, and they come at it from an explicitly religious perspective. And so I'd strongly encourage you to take a look at that report. It has some really outstanding writing from leading academics, including sociologists, historians, some Christian theologians talking about alternative visions of what Christian patriotism might look like as opposed to Christian nationalism, and how it's different, talking about the history of white Christian nationalism and how it has roots in Jim Crow South, and before that in slavery. It's just a really illustrative report about this ideology. And then more on point to the topic of that report in particular, exactly how that ideology fed into, justified and created a permission structure for what happened on January 6th and what's continuing to happen in our country today with respect to attacks on democracy. So with all those plugs being said, I really can't recommend that enough. Just give that a look. So why do we care? I mean, I think the answer is pretty obvious. We care about how policy intersects with our day-to-day lives. We need to believe, and it is true, that making positive change in policy is possible. That we're not going to pray about this. We're going to get out there and do something about it, right? And so the only way to do that is to get involved. And this is something the other side, despite certainly their belief that prayer changes lots of things, they're getting out there and they're getting organized. So we need to do the same. So it's not just that positive change can happen, it's that we can slow or stop bad things from happening. And unfortunately in Florida, often it's that the bad things are happening with increasing frequency and that you're seeing those repercussions. But more than that, it's not just about the immediate term of what we're doing about policy, it's also normalizing our community. I think many people on this call certainly remember what it was like in the earliest days, when American Atheists was founded in 1963. You remember what it was like then. Or you remember, the 1970s or 1980s even, where being an atheist was an incredibly marginalized and incredibly hostile. You were likely to take a lot of flack for that. And in many parts of the country, you still are. I don't want to pretend that everything is hunky-dory and that everything is fixed now. It's not. But it's certainly, different in the aggregate than it was even 20, 30 years ago. So, and by the way, just doing math, 20 years ago, that was 2000. So then it was 40 or 50 years ago. It's one of those challenges of like, when you're born, you sort of like anchor that one year in your forever. Like 2000 is like the time that I immediately think of as nowish, right? So 20 years ago, oh yeah, that was the 1980s now. So yeah, thinking back to what the experience people had in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s even, and still do to this day. But we've done a lot of work and we've accomplished a lot, and that's thanks in no small part to the hard work of folks like yourselves that are building these really vibrant, strong community groups, getting out there and, just mentioned before the meeting started, the work you're doing, helping people who are experiencing homelessness, getting out there and being civically engaged. It legitimizes our position as upstanding members of our community. We shouldn't have to do that, but right, we should be able to just go through our lives and be ourselves. But often that isn't enough when you're the type of community that has been so denigrated and viewed so hostilely by so many people. And so we have to kind of work even harder to claim our legitimate spot in political and civic discourse. Other than that, we're talking about building awareness for the issues we care about. I think people have this misconception that the issues that atheists care about are very narrow, and that, we're talking exclusively, we're sitting around talking exclusively about how God doesn't exist at these meetings, when in fact we care very deeply about a whole host of issues. And according to our data, care very deeply about issues like strong public education, care very deeply about the harms that people experience in healthcare and that children experience because of religious activity, care about, just anything. There are people in this room, I'm sure, who care very deeply about things like transit policy or affordable housing, things that certainly have almost no intersection with church-state issues as they're normally thought of. But the way I like to think about this is if you're an atheist and you care about an issue, it is by definition an atheist issue. It's something that you as an atheist care about and that you as an atheist should get out there and talk about. And it legitimizes that involvement in those issues for people all over the country and in your local community. And then the last thing, of why we think this is really important is based on a whole host of experiential data that we've collected, is that the groups that are the strongest, the groups that last the longest, the groups that are the most vibrant and robust do lots of things, and they do a whole host of different things. And one of those things that really unites people is uniting behind making change, engaging in the sort of civic action that focuses the community on getting involved and engaging and changing the world for better. That can take a whole host of, that can look like a lot of different things. That can mean going out there and meeting with your elected officials. It can mean attending meetings. It can mean going out and doing a park cleanup. It can mean doing a monthly service project. You mentioned, working with people experiencing homelessness. We have people who work and do food distributions. I mean, the list kind of goes on and on about what making your community better might look like for you. But that's something that a lot of people really value. And if you're providing that programming, you're creating an outlet for that, for the people that care about that, and you're organizing that, and it gives them a reason to come to your events. It gives them a reason to care very deeply about what you're engaged in, and keeps them coming back. And it also, shows people how we're all interconnected, that there are all these different issues that people care about. There are all these different identities that people bring to the table. LGBT people, for example, aren't just LGBT people. LGBT people are also, many of them, non-religious. Women are also, many women non-religious, but also care very deeply about abortion and access to contraception, and also childcare. And if they choose to have children, they care about wanting access to affordable childcare or access to paid family leave. Men care about those things too. And so, talking about these issues broadens your base. It shows people that you care about all of these things and that you're willing to work toward changing things for the better. The opponents that we have of religious equality on the other side, they're not in control of federal lawmaking right now, at least in the executive and the legislative branches, maybe that third branch. So they've pivoted to focus primarily on the states. So we have to meet them where they are. And when I say states, I don't just mean in your state capital. I also mean locally. I mean the county board level. I mean the city. I mean the township. I mean every single school board, every single level of government you can imagine. So we have to meet them where they're at and push back so they can't build power to entrench. What happened, for example, in 2010 is that, there was this redistricting after the census. They gerrymandered everything. And so minority rule got written into the structures of these things. Now you can gerrymander state houses. It's really hard to gerrymander at-large city elections for things like school board. And so that's the kind of thing that you can get out there and do something about. States are always right at the cutting edge of laws, both bad and good. Laboratories of democracies, as the saying goes. But they're also where things are most likely to get done. We track 50 state legislative chambers. We keep an eye on what's going on, and it is wild how fast things move. A bill, some states require bills to be pre-filed, meaning they'll get filed like months before the session actually starts. But then, they'll just sit there on the calendar, and then they'll get a committee hearing on Monday. They'll get voted out of committee that same day. They'll get scheduled for a first reading on the floor of whatever chamber it is for Tuesday. They'll get a second reading on Wednesday, and they'll get voted on Thursday, and then we're done. That's how fast these things can move, as opposed to the United States Congress, where nothing happens, where there's paralysis, where just because of the structure of things, there's either no interest in legislating, or everything is about getting elected. At the state level, things just move so quickly. You can never know how fast things are going to move until they start moving, and so that's both bad and good for us. It means that good laws can get passed very quickly, but it also means we have very limited time to mobilize to try to stop the worst of the worst. So it's really important for us to know where we're starting on this. And that's why we've invested a lot of resources into our State of the Secular States report, which I'll talk about a little bit later. but so just, where we stand, I mean, I think that it's obvious that things aren't great in lots of states. Federally, there have been a few good things that have happened administratively. The Biden administration has rolled back some of the worst abuses of the Trump administration on religious issues, especially as they intersect with civil rights and civil liberties. But the Supreme Court Donald Trump was able to confirm 3 Supreme Court justices in one term. And that's just had a massive impact on the issues that we care about: religious equality, religious exemptions, things like that. Looking at things like special privileges coming down from the Supreme Court that has created permission for a lot of state bills that we've seen that are sort of similar. I'm thinking of a case called Cuomo versus Brooklyn Archdiocese that dealt with churches closing during the public health emergency. This was, not briefed as a full case. This was done on an emergency basis. So no one really knows what the final ruling would have been in that. They didn't fully explain their reasoning behind things, and they're not obligated to. It looked at, basically the explanation that we did get from the court was that the court looked at whether they treated any business more favorably than they treated churches, including things that are have nothing to do with, or nothing even comparable to churches, like a grocery store, and said that if churches couldn't meet, then none of those other places could be open as well, or the reverse. If those places were open, churches had to be open as well, despite the fact that there are obvious factual differences between how people attend church and how you attend the grocery store. And they didn't fully explain that. They didn't fully, give reasoning behind that. So we're not quite sure what the boundaries of that are, but states are moving forward anyway. That's a big problem for us. And, the federal courts and the Supreme Court in particular is going to continue to be a really big impediment for religious equality moving forward. But that doesn't mean that we can't pass good legislation that does its best to head off anticipated attacks, and that we hope is, consistent, coherent, and actually moves the needle in a positive direction. There's a lot that we can do there. But there's just so much that the Supreme Court is going to continue upending at the federal level, but that doesn't mean that we can't do something about those at the state level. The religious gatherings was one thing, but abortion cases, I think we all know that Roe is certainly not long for this world, and what that means for people in states where they either have laws still on the books or where there's an entrenched minority that opposes reproductive access. Because again, we know that something like 65 to 70% of Americans support Roe. They don't want to see it overturned. The vast majority of Americans support the right to choose, the right to decide for oneself whether or not you're going to carry a child to term. And this should not be this controversial, and yet it is. We're going to continue seeing shockwaves through a whole host of policy issues related to COVID-19. Even as states are easing restrictions, we're going to see laws justified because of COVID-19. We're seeing that with, again, these rules related to religious exemptions from public health mandates for churches. We're seeing this in, states taking away the authority of local agencies to make decisions about health, about public safety measures, just a whole host of things. But we're also seeing it in terms of accessibility and transparency. Many states during the pandemic went to online first meetings, as many of our groups did. But instead of either preserving that or making that more accessible, or taking those lessons of, oh, this actually opened things up quite a bit more. Instead, what they did is they said, okay, now we're going to go back to in person, but we're going to strictly limit things, and we're not even going to stream things. They sort of took the wrong lessons from things, saying, oh, for safety, we need to limit the number of people that are in these meetings, but also we're not going to stream them, and also you can't testify at the meeting. So, or you have 30 seconds and one person at a time. So stuff like that, where they're sort of thinking about this entirely wrong and using it as an excuse to justify locking things down. Florida seems to, certainly streams its floor proceedings and most committee hearings, but still requires that you testify in person if you want to speak before the state legislature. Now, your county, your city might be different. Some cities are doing the right thing and continuing to make these meetings accessible and open. Some of them are not. So that's something that we can certainly work on. And then the last thing, what things are happening right now in terms of the culture wars legislation, we're seeing a lot of activity right there because there's all this just pent up energy around culture war issues, because in 2000 the legislative session was really cut short because of COVID-19. So they basically didn't pass anything that was culture war-y in 2020. And then in 2021, there was a lot of like responses to COVID. Everybody was still trying to figure things out. There were a few here and there, but they really hadn't like figured out what was going on. And in 2020 and 2021, they did a lot of message testing of like what would really rile people up. And we're now seeing that come to fruition. We're seeing a lot of bills that are packaged all together, that are identical, being introduced all across the country, that really attack basic fundamental rights, that are packaged and branded in a way that's guaranteed to gin up as much opposition and hostility as possible, and that are completely messaging bills that either are so broadly written as to be likely unconstitutional, or don't actually do anything, but it's bait for people to push back on. And they say this out loud. They're explicit about what they're doing with these. And so that's what we're seeing in some of these legislatures all across the country. There's not a lot of I'm unclear in many cases what some of these laws are, like what the intended effect is, other than to be used as a political, as a cudgel in the upcoming elections. So in this year, what we've seen, I mentioned some of these significant attacks on civil rights, voting rights, access to abortion and reproductive freedom in many states, moral panic issues affecting schools in particular, certainly playing an outsized role in how we're discussing politics in the United States right now, religious exemptions to public health protections. So, I mentioned this, the churches thing. We've seen the passage of the first Religious Freedom Restoration Acts for the first time in several years. I think the last one before this year was like 5 years ago. And that one was immediately amended because it was too broad and all that. And we're also seeing, in terms of how these affect people in their day-to-day lives, dangerously broad denial of care bills that are being passed for the first time. And these are bills that essentially allow healthcare providers to turn away patients for any reason, couched in religious freedom language. The public education bills I mentioned, this was a big issue for our community. It's something that many people in our community have told us that they care a lot about. We're seeing parallels to the way like the Satanic Panic happened in the 1980s. This one is focused primarily on critical race theory, which has become sort of this catch-all term for any conversations about race, which was, again, the explicit intended outcome of this campaign was to link CRT to anything that people saw that were like, oh, I don't understand this, or this seems weird, must be CRT. And it's, kind of gone into this really weird place where we're seeing bills that are prohibiting teaching of concepts in schools without much evidence that those concepts were actually being taught. They're also, it's sort of like legislating through subtext. They've been applied, and it creates confusion. It creates this uncertainty around what these laws actually mean, to the point where teachers are self-censoring, which is, again, the intended effect. They're, wondering, how do I talk about Black History Month without talking about slavery? How do I talk about Black History Month without talking about the things Martin Luther King actually said, other than the, judge by the content of your character rather than the color of your skin? Like, how can I say anything about what Martin Luther King said other than that without potentially running afoul of this? They're also creating an environment where highly qualified, competent teachers no longer want to be teachers, because they're being pushed out of teaching by laws that essentially create liability for them, where if a parent sues them, which is now, part of what's being written into these laws, including in Florida, where they can be sued personally for $10,000, sort of like another bill speaking of abortion. And just being found innocent once doesn't immunize you from future suits. You're on the hook for all of this constantly. It engages in what we would call like cost shifting, requiring that if the parent suing, it doesn't even require to be a parent, by the way, if the person suing the teacher wins, the teacher has to pay their legal expenses. But if the teacher wins, they get nothing. And so it really disincentivizes people that would otherwise want to teach from teaching, which again is that's the goal, is to gut public education to the point where everybody is going to parochial schools where we're funding religious education with government dollars and so on. It also is a way to ramp people into a culture war frenzy. Basically, parents are feeling, certainly, and I understand why, frustration and powerlessness at schools in general because of the pandemic. People are, watching over the shoulders of parents or of their students because they've been learning at home. And now they're passing or introducing laws that require cameras. This was in Missouri. We're putting cameras in every public school so you could just watch what was going on, which strikes me as a very weird and potentially dangerous idea. But again, shifting burdens onto teachers to disclose every part of the curriculum. Now, the disclosure isn't a problem. I think people should know what their kids are learning at school, but that's more than just requiring teachers to preemptively post every single handout on the internet for public inspection and then opening them up to liability to be sued or potentially jailed or lose their teaching license or anything like that if they miss a document or they forget to post something, and creating hours and hours and hours of extra work for teachers. And that's the intended effect. It's not about transparency. I think transparency is great. I think people should know what their kids are learning, and I think parents should be involved in kids' education. This is about putting it all up online, making it accessible for this mob of people on the internet to comb through, to follow one footnote to one document that has a different footnote that leads over here to this other footnote, and then go, aha, cultural Marxism or whatever, so that they can whip themselves up into a frenzy and attack these teachers who want nothing more than to teach accurate history. And that's a big part of it. This is happening while all of these voucher programs are ramping up. The Supreme Court took a case involving funding of religious education in Maine. I mean, we can't separate these things out. These are all part of the same campaign to undercut public education. But in the atheist sphere and things that we're directly working on in addition to this, we're seeing, again, the public health exemptions. We're seeing bans on mask mandates. So, local control is great until a locality wants to do something that the governor doesn't like, that sort of thing. I mentioned RFRAs and I mentioned the broad denial of care bills. Those are just some of the things that we're seeing this year and what we saw last year. I sort of said Florida's leading the charge on this, and I don't mean that in a good way. There were on democracy related issues. We had this HB1, the protest crackdown law that was in 2021. It was signed into law in April. It was blocked by a federal judge in September, and then another lawsuit was filed by cities in November. Not great. We had election laws that buy into the big lie that the election was stolen, banning of ballot drop boxes, lawsuits about those lawsuits. The lawsuits have been filed against that case. It's sort of moving forward. The latest ruling was in November, allowing the case to move forward. They tried to ban University of Florida professors from testifying about it. And then that prompted another lawsuit. And then we have the trans sports ban. Florida was ahead of the curve, only the 8th state to ban trans young people from playing sports that comport with their gender identity. It was the 8th state to do that. Not to mention a social media bill that was, straight out of directly in response to Donald Trump being banned from Twitter and Facebook. That law was also struck down as unconstitutional and overbroad. There were school voucher laws. There was a mandatory moment of silence bill. There was a ban on businesses requiring proof of vaccinations, and that prompted a lawsuit. And then the law, one of these laws, and I don't remember which one it was, allowed the governor to override the local health orders. All of these were sort of like ticking boxes for the governor's resume. So, he could run for president in 2024. I think, anybody who's a realist kind of knows that. So, the last couple of years in Florida have, basically been a dumpster fire of terrible laws. So, like, what's going on right now? We're in the heart of the legislative session. We've got a ban on prohibiting religious gatherings, which again is a huge exemption That's HB 215 and S 254. It's already passed the Senate by a huge margin, 31-3, soon to be voted on in the House. Basically says that no emergency order, quote, can directly or indirectly prohibit a religious institution from conducting regular religious services or activities, unless it's a, quote, general provision in an emergency order, which applies uniformly to all entities in the affected jurisdiction, which basically says that if anything is open, churches have to be open. But again, what about hospitals? Are hospitals, can they be open? Can a grocery store be open, even with severe restrictions? If so, that means a church has to be open. And so, you know, this isn't just about COVID. This is about things like hurricanes. This is about, you know, like if it starts snowing in Florida, right? The sponsor of the bill literally said, if Publix is open, this is Jason Broder, if Publix is open, so is your place of worship, which I think really, you know, gets down to this, that everybody needs to eat. You can't get your bread and your hamburger through a Zoom meeting. You can often do religious worship. Many religious groups adapted. And yeah, I think it should be a pretty high barrier for the government to come in and say, listen, we can't have you gathering all together right now for X reason. I think there should be a high burden there. I think we all agree that that's something that's, you know, we shouldn't want the government doing lightly, even though we're atheists. We don't want the government saying, hey, listen, atheists of Florida, you can't get together, right? That would be, we're worried about that sort of thing. And if they can do it to a synagogue, they can do it to us, right? And so we want there to be a high barrier, but at the same time, we need to treat like things alike. If there's a meeting ban, if there's a large gathering ban, it should apply to everyone regardless of religion. Religious institutions should not be entitled to special privileges or treatment simply because they're religious in nature. As I said at the beginning, there's a huge difference between going into the grocery store, buying 10 things and walking out, and sitting in church for an hour. And that's a difference that was sort of glossed over in the Supreme Court's decision in Cuomo versus Archdiocese of New York, where, you know, Justice Gorsuch literally said, if liquor stores are open, churches should be too. And I don't know how you guys all go to the liquor store, but in general, when I'm going and, you know, picking out a bottle of wine, I don't sit next to my fellow shoppers for 45 minutes singing about, you know, the relative awesomeness of Pinot Grigio or whatever, and how, you know, I want an oaky Merlot, you know, as part of that. I go in, grab something and leave. And I don't do it for hours at a time with the same group of people week after week. These are just different things. And so it's really hard for general provisions like that are like sort of the exemption in the law. It almost will never apply, because how do you apply those to all entities in a jurisdiction? Hospitals are different from police stations. Police stations are different from grocery stores and movie theaters. They're all different and they require different rules, and that's common sense, but they're creating this, they call it a first nation status, basically, where religion has to be treated as good as the least restrictive thing anywhere. Religion has to be accommodated in that way, and that's what we don't want. There's also a 15-week abortion ban that's going to be voted on in the House this upcoming week. There's the parental rights in education bill, and that's in scare quotes intentionally. That's basically a grab bag bill that has just a whole host of different issues crammed into it under the guise of education. That's the bill that is kind of being said. It has a provision about the don't say gay stuff, where you're not allowed to talk about sexual orientation or gender identity in public schools. If you're a teacher and a student came to you and said, hey, you know, I'm nervous about coming out, but I think I might be gay, or I might be, you know, bi or something, that teacher is obligated to out the young person to their parent. You know, there was a moment that kind of went viral in this discussion where somebody asked the sponsor of the bill if somebody came into school and said, you know, I was thinking about being a vegetarian. The teacher was obligated to immediately contact the parents and say, hey, little Johnny just came in and said they might be vegetarian, you know, or vegan. Oh my God. That you have to tell the parent immediately about that, because it requires disclosure. I think it's phrased as any change in the students' physical, emotional, or mental well-being or health or something like that, or a change in their status, and you're obligated to report that. Now, I'll note that in Florida, parents or religious leaders, pastors, are not obligated to report things like child abuse or child neglect if they're religious leaders, but if they, but a public school teacher is obligated to report if they think they might be a vegetarian or might be gay. So that's what we're talking about here. We've got the Stop Woke Act, which is hilariously named. It's a ban on discussion in workplaces and in classrooms, but also creates a private cause of action, allowing either employees or parents to sue if that is violated. It criminalizes healthcare. There's a bill that criminalizes healthcare for trans youth. And then again, there's this broad medical denial of care bill, HB 747, SB 1820. And that one I want to talk a little bit more about because it really is the worst of the worst. This is the broadest medical denial of care bill that we've seen. It includes not just doctors and hospitals, but also pharmacists, insurance agencies, and so on, that allow them to refuse to provide medically necessary healthcare based on their own religious beliefs, regardless of the beliefs of the individual patient that they're treating. There already exist many carve-outs and exemptions that are similar at the federal and state level. Florida already has a denial of care provision related specifically to abortion and contraception. This extends it essentially to all procedures. We've seen these be introduced in a number of states. However, they, have not passed. But recently, these just extraordinary denial of care provisions have passed in a couple of states, Arkansas and Ohio. Florida would be the third. Unlike previous laws, this bill, as I said, differs in a couple of ways. Number one, as I said, it applies to all healthcare services. It allows opt-out not just for religious, but also moral or ethical beliefs. It applies not just to providers, but also to healthcare payers, so the insurance companies, and even employers who are self-insured. If you're not aware of what a self-insured employer is, that means that you're an employer of significant enough size where you can essentially pay the medical bills of your employees. And I want to point out that 68% of employers that provide insurance self-insure. So, for example, if you work for a big company, your plan might be administered by a health or by an insurance company, but actually the company pays. And so if the company decides, hey, you know what, we're a closely held company, we don't want to pay for, let's say they're owned by Christian Scientists, we don't want to pay for anything, right? We want to pay for prayer, and we want to pay for that type of healing. That's all we're going to pay for. That would presumably be legal under this. A great way to save a lot of money, not a great way to retain employees, I would imagine, but it would be legal. What if this were passed? What would it actually look like? Number one, they don't have to tell you ahead of time. So you could go to a hospital that's taking advantage of this, and they could just not tell you that they don't provide X treatment or Y option. And they don't have to tell you until you're checked in, you're ready to go. And in fact, they don't have to tell you that they're not even offering it as an option. They can just say, well, here's your best choice, and give you something in the alternative. So if you, for example, and this is already the case in many places, if you walk in and you want a tubal ligation because you've had difficult pregnancies and you're done with it, they don't have to tell you that they don't perform that service. They can just tell you, oh, we think that's a bad idea, here's a better option, and have it be completely running counter to your wishes and to what's medically in your best interests. They don't have to tell you any of that. They also, under this law, wouldn't have a requirement to refer you to a different provider. And that's sort of an issue when you want a specific procedure. It also creates a cause of action if, let's say, a nurse or a frontline provider says, I don't want to do this. I don't want to perform any procedure that is like this. And the employer says, no, it's your job. You need to do this. It allows the individual to sue the company for treble damages. So there's a violation. It allows suing for triple. We're included in this, as I said, are doctors, medical assistants, PAs, nurses, pharmacists, pharmacy employees, the cashier at the pharmacy, any provider, any insurance company, any staff member of a provider, of an insurance company, anybody could pick and choose who they serve, and what procedures they perform, denying all or any partial or partially needed care or treatment. Nursing home staff could override patient directives on end-of-life care. If you wish to not receive any, heroic measures, they could override that. Pharmacists could refuse to fill prescriptions for Viagra, PrEP, HIV medication, birth control, hormone treatment for trans people. People who are unvaccinated could refuse and then kind of on the flip side, people who are unvaccinated, maybe something they haven't thought of here, could be refused service by any health provider or insurance as well. But then again, they could also refuse to provide any service for vaccinated employees. Like, that's how broad of a law we're talking about here. And lastly, as I said, this extends to insurance providers. They would be able to refuse to pay for any service and then claim it was due to religious beliefs. They give them just really just a carte blanche excuse to refuse any claim, as long as it can be justified by a corporate guideline of some kind. And despite this bill actually passed out of the Health Professions and Health, or the House Professions and Health Subcommittee in a 12-6 vote. It still has to go through a couple of other committees, and we can stop it. And I'll give you a number to text to help out with that if you'd like toward the end. But like that's how broad these bills are that we're talking about here. This is not some very narrowly tailored thing about, oh, it's religious freedom. No. This is just over the top. So what are we doing about this? Well, we're obviously trying to stop the bill, but also we're trying to go in the other direction and increase transparency in healthcare. We've introduced a bill with some partnerships in both the House and the Senate. We've brought on a number of really great allies to help us with this. And this just isn't just happening in Florida. We've got this working in other states as well. It's called the Healthcare Transparency and Accessibility Act. It protects patients by ensuring that they know what's going on, and that they know at the point of service that if they're denied care, what they can do in the alternative. And it basically says that facilities who refuse to treat people or provide treatment on the basis of any of these exemptions have to disclose that and then inform the Department of Public Health so that consumers, so the patients can make an informed choice about their health when they're able to do that. We're also, we know this doesn't fully fix the problem, but it's a step toward disclosure because, a lot of we've worked really hard to make sure that we believe this would stand up against constitutional muster around things like compelled speech, and that it would still be in the lines of the law that have been laid out. We can't, say if you're at a religious hospital, you have to disclose this because that would be unconstitutionally targeting religion. And so we have to make sure. And by the way, this law, the other law makes it clear that it's not just religious institutions that can do this, but anybody. So we need to make sure it applies to all hospitals and healthcare providers equally. A way that we can push back on this is to tell personal stories, to make sure that we have personal stories ready about people who have been impacted by denials of treatment, what impact that had on their life, how that, what they had to do instead, because those are really compelling stories. And frankly, they really shine a light on how extreme these laws are. And so as I said, we're working on this in multiple states: Colorado, New York, Maryland, and a few others, Virginia. We've got a lot going on. We're trying to get these introduced, and we have some good prospects in other states. So what do we think is happening more next coming up? I think I talked a little bit about this. Going to be more of the same, more RFRAs, more broad denial of care bills, more anti-diversity education stuff under this banner of parental rights, more of these bounty laws like what we saw in Texas with the abortion bill, and then more attacks on reproductive health care. I mean, we're seeing it in Mississippi, Arkansas. People are just, they're chomping at the bit, ready for Roe to be overturned so they can ban abortion. And then more attacks on trans people, specifically trans youth in particular, and LGBTQ people more broadly. That's what's happening on the negative side. And all of this, and I need to stress this, is linked by one common thread, and it's these Christian nationalist groups that really want to implement a very specific vision of religion into American public life. And I'll also stress these provisions are not popular. These bills do not have majority support of the American people when you ask them, but they have the support of majority of these legislative chambers that have been gerrymandered to within an inch of their life, right? That sort of counter-democratic, small d democratic attack on on public institutions is the whole game. That they need to entrench this anti-majoritarian minority rule now while they still can, and that's what we're seeing. And they're sort of using this as like a last gasp to try to lock that in while they still can. And so what do we do to fight back about this? Number one is just awareness. People need to talk about this. We need to shine a light on how this is happening, and talk about this issue. And we've been very successful in getting people to talk about this. I became president of American Atheists in 2018. At the time, we were the only ones talking about the dangers of Christian nationalism. I think, again, Andrew's book came out around then as well. It was like us talking about Christian nationalism, and that was it. In some very small academic circles, people were talking about the threat of white Christian nationalism. Since then, there's been like this explosion of it, talking about it. And, after what happened January 6th of last year, everybody's talking about it, which is good. It's one of those times when I sort of jokingly said to Andrew at one point, do you ever hate being right? Do you ever get tired of just like being proven completely right about something? And the answer, and we sort of jokingly said to each other, like, no, I like being right. I wish I hadn't been right about this, but that's really, it's frustrating, but it's true. And so we have to kind of look at this from, I guess, three angles or three prongs of this. When we're fighting back in the first instance, we have to start with the data. We need to know where we are. We need to know how things stand right now, and we need to know how these are impacting real people, and what that data looks like. So we have a State of Secular States report that we do each year that looks at where your state stands on a whole host of issues, more than 50 issues. You can learn more about the areas of law that are impacting your individual rights and what other states look like, and what we can do to bring Florida up and make sure that Floridians are getting a fair shake at things. You can also sign up for action alerts, take immediate action. These are very quick. They don't take a lot of your time, and they're very easy to do. So if you've only got a few minutes, certainly do that. Here's that number. You can text the word states to 855-465-5149, and it'll send you back a link to our action center. You can get registered for future action alerts. You can get involved, sort of get in at that ground level of like, okay, if something's coming up, I know I can take action on this very quickly. It takes just a few minutes. I would encourage you to do that. I'd also say, I mentioned the State of the Secular States report. Go to states.atheists.org or atheists.org/states, whichever you prefer. Here's the top part of Florida scorecard. We listed a category there of religious exemptions that undermine equality. That's the worst rating we have. Sorry. And you can actually at the top, it doesn't look so bad. It's when it's the part I cut off at the bottom that's a little rough. And I would encourage that's where a lot of individial policies are.
I just want to say, Nick, that I mailed this to everybody on our mailing list.
Great. Awesome. Appreciate that. But give that a shot, take a look at what's there, and see where you stand, and then look at some other states that have a different rating, see what they've got that you don't, and what you've got that they don't, that may be bad. Anything that's got a highlight in red on that there, if it's filled in and it's red, that means it's a bad law that you've got. If it's not filled in red, it's a bad law you don't have. And then blue is the opposite. If it's blue and pointing up and filled in, it means you've got it. If it's blue and not filled in, you don't have it, but it's good and you should try to get it. States.atheists.org, and again, this will all be at the end anyway, and I'll send this to Judy so she can make sure to distribute that as well. The second part of this is bringing the stories. I mentioned about how it's important for us to talk about how these laws affect real people. Legislators need to know about that. They need to. It's not just data. We can't just beat them over the head with data. They need to know how this in fact affects their constituents. All the data in the world, and this is one thing that I think I've mentioned to this group before, maybe the last time I spoke, or that I've mentioned to any number of other groups, is we're a community that believes a lot in data, that really puts a lot of stock in data. The data tells us that people don't just respond to data. So we have to do more than that. And if we take that seriously, if we take the perception we have of our community as being evidence-driven, as following the evidence as it's put in front of us, then we need to be responsible to that. We need to be responsive to that. And the data tell us that just data is not enough. And so we have to identify people that are impacted by this in their day-to-day lives, and then bring that to bear. And the best ways to do that is to build partnerships, is to not just look, within the membership of Atheists of Florida, but for all of you who are interested in whatever issue you might be interested in, if it's repro, if it's, abortion access, go out there and attend meetings for the local Planned Parenthood, for the local NARAL, or whatever they're calling themselves now, the URGE, or all of the groups that do state level work on abortion. Find an abortion fund, anything like that. If that's the issue that interests you, go do that. Go get involved with that. If it's LGBT issues, get involved with the local PFLAG, the Human Rights Campaign, etc. If it's transit, go find your local YIMBY group, or whatever it is, your local mass transit group. If it's affordable housing, find a group that advocates on that, and just go to their meetings. Attend, even if it's not every meeting, attend once in a while, and also mention while you're there, hey, I also attend Atheists of Florida. There are some other members of our group that are interested in this, that I know would love to help. What can we do? And then you want to be a good, reliable foot soldier, as it were. You're not trying to take over. You're going there to help, and that's a really valuable thing to do. Because it shows that you're willing to be a good partner, that you're willing to help out, and that you're wanting to get engaged and to help them build power as well. That's really vital. And the last part of that is, if you're not sure where to look, let us know. Reach out, contact American Atheists. We have contacts with so many national groups on a whole host of issues, because we're wanting to empower you to get more engaged on these issues. And we can help connect you with the right person if you're not sure where to look, or if you're not sure if this group, secretly is actually super religious or something, and is going to be really freaked out that you're an atheist. Because we've had that happen. I won't lie, that does happen from time to time. We might have some recommendations of where you can go, and if we don't know, I'm sure one of our other partners might know, and we can get you in touch with somebody who can help. But like, having those stories is really valuable, and going out there and being heard matters. It really drives conversation in the media. It's really, there was a whole big story written about how, the atheists and the religious people disagreed about this moment of silence bill, but it wasn't angry. Nobody was yelling. Everybody wasn't hating on each other. It drove a media cycle, and again, legitimizes our participation in this whole process, and gets the word out so that people know, oh, wait a second. Yeah. I've heard of those atheists. They're interested in these things. This is Devin Graham pictured, who works with us. She's based in the Tallahassee area. But like, that's really important to get that word out there that you care about these things. It builds our partnerships. It helps us find allies. And again, it legitimizes our participation in civic life, not just our participation in the political process, but our participation more broadly in civic life, which are different things. And lastly, it shows that our elected officials, that we're paying attention. They know they're accountable to the people who vote. What they don't realize is that atheists are one of the most politically engaged constituencies out there. There's basically no constituency, no religious demographic that is more likely to volunteer for candidates, donate to candidates, and vote than atheists. They're highly motivated, highly engaged. And that's atheists, by the way. It's different for nones, the nothing in particular people. If you lump all of them together, we're still high up there, but it's like atheists and agnostics are hugely more likely to vote and attend protests, donate to candidates, volunteer for candidates, all those things. And then the non-religious people, just nones, nothing in particular, who aren't atheists or agnostics, are roughly in line with the average American. But we pull that whole group up. So some distinctions there, some tricky things with data. But atheists and agnostics, we're talking about 10, 12% of the population. That's a big number. And so people need to understand that we are a big group of people that care very deeply about a whole host of issues, and that we vote. But we need to show that. We need to get out there and show them that we're paying attention, that we're voting, that we exist in their communities, that, atheists don't just exist in they think that we're like in New York City and, Miami, I guess, and that's it, like big cities. But no, atheists are everywhere. Many of you were mentioning that you're, in very, very rural, very red parts of the country, where there's one person per square mile or whatever. like I grew up in that too. I know what that's like. So atheists truly are parts of every community, and they need to know that. The other part of why we need to do this is we can actually stop these things. We can stop these bad bills. In Arizona, a bill was introduced that was very similar to the bill that's being considered in Florida right now that bans medical care for trans youth. It bans all forms, it would have banned all forms of gender affirming care, which for young people is defined as something like a puberty blocker, which is reversible, and counseling. No child is having surgery at the age of 13. It literally does not happen. And so this is all, again, just a whipped up hysteria that has no bearing in reality, but has very real effects on trans youth, and is rooted in bigotry and a fundamental misunderstanding of the issue, and has real impact on people, on people's mental health. And getting together and identifying, as I said, people who are experts in the issue and can bring the facts to bear about what's going on and what the data shows. But also, this slide mentions Skylar Morrison, 13-year-old who was, would be impacted by this. And she got up there and testified, and, they had a hearing on this, and, the Arizona Senate is closely divided. And what ended up happening is one of the Republicans on the panel changed his views because he was meeting with people that this would impact. And he said in there that those stories made the difference. He acknowledged the numerous testimonials from parents and children, and said that although he does believe that gender reassignment surgery is a choice that should be made by children once they've reached adulthood, he disagreed with everything else in the bill, which is fine because surgery does not happen for children. Again, to reiterate, we heard testimony about gender affirming care saving lives. I didn't want my vote to stop those great things. And so what happened in the committee was it deadlocked 4-4 because this senator switched his vote, which meant that it didn't advance. And so that bill died in committee. And so those tools matter. Those individual stories are a powerful tool in the toolbox to stop these bills. And all you need oftentimes is one person to flip that, right? That's what we're talking about in many of these cases where, it's really hard. And, the thing that I always tell people is, if you're feeling powerless at some level of government, move one step more local. And then if that's not working, move another step more local, and just keep getting closer and closer to your front door, because that's where you can become, I don't know if I'm allowed to use this metaphor, the big fish in the pond, right? That when you're talking about legislating at the federal level, you're talking about, members of Congress who have hundreds of thousands of constituents. When you're talking about legislators in your state, you're talking about tens or maybe even hundreds of thousands if you're in a big state. You're talking about your county board of supervisors, county commissioners, whatever they call it there. Maybe it's, one commissioner per 10,000. Talking about your local school board, even smaller. You're talking about and you can get closer and closer and closer. And so having 3 or 4 of those stories from that person's constituency is a huge deal when you're talking about somebody who only represents a few thousand people, as opposed to somebody who represents a gazillion. And in that same vein, the last tool in the toolbox is for you to run for office. And I encourage you to do that. We, on our side, often think about things very nationally. I try to kind of push back on that. And that's why American Atheists focuses a lot on local and state issues. The further down the ballot the race is, the more likely it is to affect your day-to-day life. What is the president doing that affects your day-to-day life that much? Probably not a whole lot, actually. But we think about this in sort of 4-year cycles, and we completely forget about what happens in those off-year elections that for some reason happen in June, right? That are sort of set up in a way to minimize your participation, which is really frustrating. And make it harder for you to oh God, there was an election yesterday and I didn't even know about it, right? That's done for a reason. It's not a good reason. It's done to lock you out, and it's done to make sure that people aren't paying attention. And so we need to push back on that. Remind ourselves that politics doesn't begin and end with the House, the Senate, and the presidency. It also doesn't begin and end with the governorship and the state legislature. If we're talking about what happens, in your town, you've got your mayor, you've got your city council or your county board of commissioners. If you're talking about what happened in your individual school, you've got school boards or departments of education. I mean, Florida has mosquito control boards that, have an impact in your daily life, right? Texas has the railroad commissioner that for some reason is in control of really random parts of the state government. And these are all just like artifacts of setting up a political system 150 years ago that hasn't changed. I think it's something like 6,500 coroners are still elected, like coroner. Okay, like that's a weird thing. And I might have that number wrong, but thousands of coroners in this country are still elected. There's been a focus on like district attorney races, on judges. Judges are elected in many parts of the country. In most parts of the country, some type of judges are elected. But also you have county clerks. I have friends from home. One of my good family friends is the county clerk of our county. The county I grew up in has like 25,000 people in it. So it's not a lot of people, but like she's in charge of administering elections. And then there might be somebody else who's in charge of registering people to vote. It's like the county tax collector or something like that, depending on the title. And so there's all these like different moving parts, and the other side has spent a lot of time investing in and encouraging people to run for those. Steve Bannon, I think we all know who Steve Bannon is, has gone on his podcast recently and told people to run for these offices. And we've seen this uptick in people registering after he said that. And, there are people always say, well, I'm not cut out to be an elected official. It's so expensive. It's like, I'm not what qualifies me to be a county commissioner or to be the city clerk or whatever. Donald Trump was president of the United States. Louis Gohmert is a member of Congress. Tommy Tuberville, a former football coach, is a senator from Alabama. You're qualified to run for a local office. You're qualified to run for any office, frankly. You're certainly qualified to run for school board. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't even have to have been a teacher. You just have to care about these issues. You have to be able to answer some very basic questions about why you're running, what issues you want to deliver on, and why people should vote for you. And if you can answer those questions, you can run for office, and there are tons of resources out there to help. There are 500,000 elected offices in this country. You are qualified to run for many of them, for most of them. We're in that, people are familiar with the Dunning-Kruger syndrome, where people are think they're overestimate their qualification. There's like the chart kind of goes like this, where as your expertise increases, you actually think you're less qualified for things because you know how much you don't know, right? Where a lot of us are in that valley, where the people who know nothing or know very little are like, oh my God, I'm the smartest person ever because I watched a YouTube video. You're more sophisticated than that, and so you know how complicated this stuff is. That doesn't mean you're unqualified. In fact, that's an asset. Knowing what you don't know, again, puts you ahead of like 60% of members of Congress, right? Already. So that's important. You don't have to be outgoing. You don't have to be an extrovert. You don't have to be rich. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to be any of those things. You just have to be willing to put in the work, and you have to be willing to put yourself out there. As I said, Christian nationalist groups have been investing in this for decades. They're doing it now. They're doing it in many cases to subvert democracy, but they're also doing it to advance policy agendas. We care about democracy. We care about protecting the rights of our community and our fellows. That's really important to us, and we care about issues. And so we shouldn't shy away from this. In fact, we need to be out there. We need to be engaged in this. There are a lot of resources out there for you if you're thinking about running. Start with groups like the League of Women Voters. If you're just looking for very nonpartisan, right down the road, right down the line, factual information about like deadlines, getting registered, things like that. The National Council for State Legislatures has good information. Again, that's right down the line, nonpartisan completely, just has the accurate information for things. If you're looking as running as an open atheist, groups that can help you are the Center for Free Thought Equality can help. Our state policy manager, Brett Parker, is a former member of the Kansas House of Representatives. He was a member of the leadership for the Democratic caucus in Kansas. We're certainly happy to help with that as well. We are nonpartisan, so and we don't endorse candidates, but we have resources as well. You can look at groups like Run for Something Civics. Run for Something is partisan, Run for Something Civics is nonpartisan. Their website is runforsomethingcivics.net, very easy. And just Google it. Like, I want to run for office. What do I do? find people who can help you, because that on-ramp, that creating that structure for you to get involved is the most important thing, of like creating that, like, yeah, actually I can do this. And I would certainly encourage anybody who is even half thinking about it to look at it. Because we're talking about 500,000 races in this country. There are places, I bet, in your communities that have had people running uncontested for years. And all it takes in many of these places is a few hundred votes to win in, especially when it's an election that happens in, July of an off year, right? We're talking about a handful of voters. And if you can identify who you need to talk to, and we're talking about like, oh, you need to go talk to 1,000 people. I mean, when I worked on the election in 2008, I, on average, knocked on 150 to 200 doors a day. You can knock out 1,000 votes, 1,500 votes in a week. You can do that. And then you talk to them again. And that's the whole game, is to get out there and talk to those people as many times as possible, have answers to those few basic questions of what issues you care about, why you're running, and what you're going to do for them. And don't lie to them. Be open about who you are, what you believe, and you too can be an elected official. And that's, we need to make sure we're thinking about ourselves as civically engaged people with stake in this, because we are, and willing to get out there and do something to make a change. And depending on how much time you've got in your day, what you can do to make a change ranges from, as I said, starting out with getting on our action alert list. That's like, take 2 minutes and do it. You can, in the middle, if you've got a few hours, if you've got a day, submit some testimony, meet with your elected official, share a personal story, go out there and testify, volunteer with a group that you agree with, get engaged that way. And if you want to make the big investment, it's run for office, really put yourself out there that way. Sort of the continuum of what you have time to do, because not everybody's the same. I get that. Not everybody has time to run. Not everybody's in a position to do it, and that's fine. But find what works for you. And if I want to contest the idea that you're not qualified or you don't have the time, it is a sacrifice. It's hard, but it's important. And I don't think anyone ever accused atheists of not caring about important things. And so we should certainly, and we want to make that change, and we want to put our hands into action on that stuff. So with that, I am happy to take questions. And so if you raise your hand in the chat, I'm sure I can recognize people from that.
I have a couple of questions that were put in the chat while you were talking.
Great. We'll start with those, and then we'll do the hands raised.
What is the AMA doing about any of this, if anything?
AMA meeting the American Medical Association, yeah. I assume. Yeah. So expert testimony on a lot of these. The AMA strongly opposes some of these issues. I don't know offhand about they oppose these bills, but they're not like whipping support against many of them, because they're worried about partisan, like they're very concerned, and I understand why, about like repercussion of coming across as too political. They obviously, their professional ethics rules say you can't do that. And they don't want their people doing that. But as far as like the law itself, I'm not sure what they've engaged in Florida. If you're a doctor and you're a member of the AMA, I would certainly reach out and say, hey, I've seen this. Have you come out against this? Because I think this is really dangerous. And many of these bills actually say that like the AMA or other licensing agencies can't take negative action against a doctor or a medical professional who utilizes the law, which is likely unconstitutional, by the way. And so like that's a potential concern as well. And so if you're a doctor, if you're a member of any of these professional licensing agencies, whether it's the AMA or a similar organization for registered nurses or LPNs or PAs or anything, reach out to them and say, you really need to come out against this, because this is terrifying. And, we're not doctors. So if we're coming to them, they're just like, oh, go away, atheists, in terms of American atheists.
Yeah.
But if you're a doctor, they're going to care about this. And, you can come out and find other doctors who are like, oh my God, this is horrifying, and go testify about why this is terrible, and, get a bunch of people of your fellow doctors to sign on. That's the sort of thing that, if you're willing to do it, you should do it. Hospital systems, if it's a publicly funded hospital system, I'm sure that there are people there, even in the administration, that would be like, oh God, this, because it makes it so complicated in the administrative side, because of what I said about, if this passes and, the hospital policy is we have to treat everybody and we provide the best medical advice. But then you have some doctor or some nurse going rogue and saying, well, I'm not going to do X, Y, or Z. They can't discipline that person. That creates just a really terrible, that creates a whole lot of problems for the hospital itself. And so laying that out for them and why they should oppose it, I think would be really valuable. But I don't know on the AMA itself.
Okay. And this is the next question. As someone who works for an HHS agency, Health and Human Services,
Yep.
what can I do on an individual level?
Yeah. Same thing is, if you're a, I assume when they say HHS, I assume they mean the federal HHS, but because I don't know what Florida calls theirs. It might be similar. Similarly, you're allowed, even if you're a federal employee, and you could be a contractor, so this may not apply. You're allowed to speak on issues of importance as long as you make it clear that you're not speaking on behalf of your agency, right? And the sort of the lower down you are in the totem pole of hierarchy, the more likely it is that you're able to speak out on individual policy issues. And so use that expertise, if you're a doctor, if you're a nurse, if you're a provider of healthcare, certainly testify on these things. I would also certainly run it up if you have, if you're working for federal HHS, they're aware of these things because we've talked to them about it, but flag it for the chain of command and say, I'm really worried about this. This seems like a nightmare. Have you been paying attention to this? Could you pass this up to your boss, who passes it up even further, about, the risks of this? And it's not partisan. That's like, this would make it really hard for us to do our jobs, and I'm really worried about this. And just follow whatever, I don't want you to put your job in danger, but follow whatever ethical and, disclosure requirements are required for you at your place of employment. And, you know better than I who to take this sort of thing to, and who to talk to. And if you have questions, just reach out to us. Contact Allison Gill, who is our Vice President for Legal and Policy. She can help you navigate this, and we're happy to speak about it there.
Okay, so Rick Gold has his hand up.
Hey, Rick.
Hi, thank you for a very organized and compelling presentation. I'm with the Jews for a Secular Democracy Florida, which is part of the coalition that is working with American Atheists on the Healthcare Transparency Act, and last year to fight the moment of silence.
Yep.
And it's been wonderful to work together, but the environment, as you've described in Florida, is just so oppressive.
Yep.
That we're setting ourselves up for failure in many ways, and for the years to come, unfortunately. How do you deal with that? How do you maintain the momentum, the incentive, the interest in organizing people to focus on issues that just don't have a lot of chance of success at this point?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Rick. I mean, it's the single biggest organizing question that a lot of us face is we feel like we're beating our heads against the wall, and you're getting punched round after round, to mix metaphors here, and falling down a lot. The thing I'll say is the other side has been willing and is willing to invest in building structures that are likely to last, and they look at those losses in the short term as almost like business expense. You've got to invest in research and development. You've got to invest in capacity building before you get to where you want to go. A lot of people on our side, and this is something that I've heard, what's her name? Amanda Littman who founded Run for Something back in 2017, that she talks about that, we want to be inspired by the issues, and we need to be inspired by issues, and we want to be, we want to find things that really get us excited, and that's important. But groups like, to pick a boogeyman here, the Koch brothers or Sheldon Adelson, they looked at the investments they made in state level work as business investments. They didn't pour millions and millions and millions of dollars into this with the expectation that they were going to win overnight, or in 2 years, or in 4 years, or even in 10 years. This is a long-term capacity building project for them. We have to think about some of this stuff in those kind of cold, calculating terms of that this is going to take time, and we are going to lose, and we're going to lose big when we first start out, just like every issue does. But we have to recognize that it's important, and that I stay motivated on this by recognizing that we are making progress, not uniformly throughout the country, but there are places where we're making big changes that are affecting people's lives for the better. And that if we can do it there, we can do it anywhere else. It just will take more time. So, for example, it took us years to pass the first ban on child marriage. It took us another year, 2 years, to pass the second one. And then the year after that, we passed 3 more. So that first victory, that first time you win, is like, again, it's manna for the soul, right? It's the sweetest victory you can imagine when you win once. Now, this goes back to the question about like where in the tree of levels of government do all these things fall. When we lose a thing at the national level, it's like, oh, that sucks, that's too bad. But we're talking about this abstract notion of Washington, D.C., right? Like, okay, well, I wish we had won, but we didn't. When it happens in your state, it's much more personal, because it's like, I went and testified about this. I worked on this bill. I worked on these issues. And, when a state legislator, for example, this happens all the time, where we have a state legislator lined up who's going to help us, who's going to introduce the bill, and then they back out. It's like, or they say, well, we can't do it this year. We'll get to it next year. But I still like you guys, or whatever. It's like a punch in the teeth. It's like, what's your problem with me? Why do you not like me? And then when it happens in your county or in your city, it's even more personal, because not only were you testifying about it or submitted testimony, you were at the meeting, and you took 3 meetings with 3 different commissioners to talk about why this matters. And so like that level of personal involvement is important. It really is a driving factor. It really, it personalizes this, and it's the only way to win. But the losses suck. Losing sucks. Nobody likes losing at all. Least of all when it's like you on the line, when you're the person that's out there. And the same holds true, by the way, for elections, right? When your preferred candidate that you voted for at the federal level loses, you're like, oh, that sucks. They would have been great. When the local candidate that you volunteered for and phone banked for loses, it's a kick in the teeth. And when you run and lose, which, by the way, the overwhelming majority of first-time candidates lose, and that's fine, because that's just what happens. When you lose, man, is that shitty. That's the worst feeling, because nobody likes to lose. And so part of it is we have to be inspired by the issues, but we also have to be clear-eyed about the stakes on these things. And I think the thing, like if I had a magic bullet to your question of how do you stay motivated, the best way to stay motivated is to think more and more locally. That, if nothing's happening in Washington that you like, and you're just so tired of the horse race, like who cares if Joe Biden is polling at 44% or 46%? Why is this daily news? I don't care, right? What I care about is what our state is doing. And oh my God, our state is also a dumpster fire. What is our county doing? Okay, the county's better. Okay, we can actually move something here. Great, we can get an ordinance passed, right? And then you can get those small victories, and that keeps people motivated. And so I guess, the magic bullet, I would say, is get closer and closer and closer and closer and closer to your front door on whatever you're organizing around, because you can find a way to win on that thing. And it doesn't have, and it's not going to be like, oh my, we're going to tax the churches in the Pines, right? Like that's not going to happen. So if you live in the Pines, like that's not it. But we're going to pass an ordinance, or we're going to work on something that is something I care about, that has broad appeal. I mentioned the child marriage bills. That had bipartisan support. We had like a voice vote in some of these places on this. We got introduced a bill in New York that requires that courts and the judicial system make available to people secular alternatives to 12-step programs for people who are recovering from addiction, for addiction services. A common sense thing that in New York hadn't passed, and it has bipartisan support because we were able to walk in and say, listen, this is common sense, we can get this done. And it improves the lives of real people who are struggling with addiction and who until now have been said, well, you don't have an alternative, suck it up. Unless you want to go to jail, you need to go to this religious program. I mean, that's not a small thing for thousands of people who are struggling with addiction, who want to change their lives for the better and that need an alternative. That's a big deal. That improved people's lives. And it probably saved some people's lives that an evidence-based solution was available other than, well, just ask God. You need to ask God to fix you, right? And so that's how I think about it. That's not going to work for everybody, but that's what I would say is focus on the things you can control and on the things that you can change and move the needle on, as the best way to fight burnout. And burnout's a real thing. Take some time, take a day off. You don't have to do this. You don't have to go 200% every day of the week.
Okay, one more question from the public room, then we're going to close it to go to the private room for members only. Anybody have a question? No?
Nobody wants my picks for the Super Bowl? I don't know. Don't ask.
I have no clue.
Yeah, I don't know. No idea.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and...
Michael has a question, but it looks like...
Yeah, but Michael's a member.
Oh, okay.
Gets to go to the private room.
Oh,
go ahead, Michael, ask it, because other people might be interested.
I'm just wondering, because I live in an area where it's very sort of rural and out there, and there really isn't a lot of like atheist or anything organizations out there. And anytime I try reaching out to like the bigger organizations, I mean, I'm in Illinois, so they're all centered in the Chicago area and in the bigger cities, and I'm way down here in southern Illinois.
Yeah.
So, I mean, is there specifically anybody I could go to like get help organizing something? Because, I mean, if I organize something, it's going to have to be basically from the ground up.
Yeah. As far as like, do I know offhand who to reach out to? The short answer is no, I don't know offhand. I can, if you email our national field director, Sam McGuire, she might have a recommendation for people that are nearby. And the thing also to keep in mind is if you're like right in, especially if you're near a border of some state. So for example, if you're in the panhandle of Florida, or if you're in, Southern Illinois, look at the surrounding states. There might be something that is nearby that you just, that isn't like in Ohio or that isn't in Illinois, right? But is in Missouri. Or you may have to think about, like St. Louis, for example, if you're talking about Southern Illinois, or if you're in the panhandle of Florida, you might have to look at Alabama. And like, you're in Pensacola, and there isn't any. Pensacola's pretty big, but maybe there's something in Mobile, right? Just across the border. And so it kind of depends on what you're looking at. If you're looking for like political engagement or getting involved in the state legislature, you're kind of limited, obviously you want to stay in the state borders, right? Because you're in Illinois. And so like Springfield might be a ways away, but you can testify from anywhere. You have elected officials. But if you're looking for community, it is obviously much more like geographically focused, and you need to be in that area. And, the sort of annoying answer is sometimes you do have to build it and people will come, because all of these groups start when somebody said, hey, this isn't around here. I don't know where to turn. That's how all of these groups got started. And that's the only way to really start a sustainable group is to identify the need, program effectively, think about what people around you want, And, I guess a good starting point is not to start with, I'm going to start an atheist group. It's to go to groups that are working on issues, or a social group that's like a running group. For, like, if you're a runner, go, and there's like a group that runs every week in the park, go to that and say, I keep running into this where, the church, like a lot of church groups are around. I don't really go to church. I'm actually an atheist. Does anybody know what to do socially? And you might be surprised what you find, because a lot of groups have like really not great social media presence, or they're not listed on whatever site you're using, and so it's hard to find. But you'd be surprised if because people will come and say, oh, you know what, yeah, me too, actually I've had that problem, and suddenly you've got 5 or 6 people. And then if you do board games, there's a game night that you go to. If there's a knitting club, if there's a book club, you never know. Look around as well for groups that do other sorts of civic engagement. And so, there are a lot of NAACP type groups, or the Urban League, especially if you're talking about Black Americans, people of color who, are sort of plugged into that. There are all these like civic groups that do things like this. And I guarantee to you that the churches do exactly this as well, where they, not necessarily intentionally of like, oh, nefarious reasons, but they like go out there and all their members go do things and then say, oh, we have a social that we'd love for you to come to. It's at the Methodist Church. How exciting. But you can do exactly the same thing. It's not, it's not nefarious. It's like, I want to find people to hang out with and have a good time with. Nothing wrong with that. And you can build it and be kind of informal.
Of course, it doesn't help that I'm sort of a misanthrope and not really all that charismatic. So,
but the misanthrope thing might get in the way. But everybody's got some level of charisma that they can turn on when they want to hang out with people. And so, but yeah, it depends on what you're looking for. It depends on what exactly you're wanting to get involved in. At the very least, I would say find a group that is secular. And by that, I mean non-religious. I don't mean like atheist. And you'd be surprised that there might be, they might be people of all stripes who share some values with you, and that where you find overlap on 1 or 2 important issues to you, there might be something there. But yeah, I won't lie and say that it's easy in a place where, where you're in small town USA. It's hard. It is really hard to find that. And, maybe you have to drive for quite a ways. But that's tough. And there's no easy answer to it. But expand your search, look regionally, look at surrounding states to see if there's something that, again, is focused on like 1 or 2 issues that you really care about and are passionate about. And then you can build something from there once you kind of get a foot in the door.
Thank you. One quick question. Someone asked in the chat, if you don't have a smartphone to text states to your number, is there another way to get to the Action Center?
Yeah, it's at atheist.org. If you go to our website on your computer, I think it'll like if you text it, it'll send you a link, and then you can probably just type in that link on a browser. If you don't have a smartphone, if you don't
have a smartphone, you can't text it.
you can text short codes
from your computer. Yeah.
No, you can text the short code, and it'll send you the link, and then just copy and then just type that link in. I think that'll still work. Yeah.
Sometimes you can do that with phones.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to open the room now.
If you are pleased with our programs, please tap the like button and then subscribe to our channel. Don't forget the bell so you don't miss any notices of new material. We usually post new content every week. See our created playlists to discover events thus far this year, or to see a list of topics and speakers from our rapidly growing and diverse collection since 1992.